The day began with the kind of stillness that feels like a warning, the kind that settles over you before a storm you cannot see. Evan Foster, a young elementary school teacher in Portland, walked into the polished marble lobby of Goldstein and Associates with a heart heavier than the rain-filled sky outside. 6 weeks had passed since the crash that had taken Harold and Elizabeth Foster. The grandparents who had raised him, shielded him, loved him when his own parents could not be bothered. They were wealthy, yes, but they had taught him that wealth meant nothing without kindness, humility, and a willingness to protect the vulnerable. He expected the meeting to be about legal formalities, signatures, condolences, the slow unwinding of the estate. What he did not expect was for the conference room door to open onto a half circle of faces that were anything but grieving. His father, Richard, sat stiff in a navy blazer, jaw locked. His mother, Diane, perched beside him, her manicured hands clasped too tightly. Jason, his younger brother, leaned back with an expression of mild annoyance, as though this were an errand keeping him from something better. And then there were his Aunt Pamela and Uncle Stephen, both dressed in black, but their eyes sharp, calculating. The air thickened when Matthew Goldstein, the family's longtime lawyer, took his place at the head of the table. His voice was steady, precise, the cadence of a man who knew the weight of his words. According to the last will and testament of Harold and Elizabeth Foster, their entire estate valued at approximately $20 million, including full ownership of Foster Logistics, is bequeathed to their grandson, Evan Foster. The silence that followed was almost tangible, pressing against the walls. Matthew continued, reading from the document that left no room for misinterpretation. No portion of the estate is to be distributed to Richard Foster, Diane Foster, Jason Foster, Pamela Whitmore, or Stephen Whitmore. It was as if the heirs had been set alight. Diane's mouth tightened to a thin, colorless line. Jason exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Pamela muttered something about brainwashing, while Richard's voice cut through like a blade. You don't know the first thing about managing that kind of money. They've manipulated you. Evan, this is not right. But Evan sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the legal papers, the ink still sharp and black. He could hear Harold's voice in his memory, measured, calm, telling him that character was worth more than any fortune, and that there would come a day when he would have to stand alone, unshaken. The tension in that room was more than anger. It was the unveiling of truth. These were people who had barely visited Harold and Elizabeth, people who had been absent in every meaningful way, now suddenly reaching for what they believed they were owed. The inheritance had not changed Evan's understanding of them, it had revealed it. As the meeting concluded, the murmurs began, whispered words spilling over into sharper accusations that he was too young, too naive, too influenced by two old people who had spoiled him. But the reality was simpler. Harold and Elizabeth had trusted him because they had seen who he was when no one else was watching. Evan left the office that day with the weight of $20 million in legal terms, but the burden of something far heavier in his chest. He knew this was not the end of it. Families like his did not retreat. They circled, waiting for a moment of weakness. And yet, as he stepped into the gray Portland afternoon, he felt something steadier than fear. He felt the quiet certainty that the people who had loved him most had prepared him for exactly this. Because money can be taken, but the strength to stand your ground, especially against those who share your blood, is a legacy no one can touch. If you want to hear the rest of how Evan faced down every demand, every betrayal, and uncovered the one inheritance his family could never take, stay with Heart Story. The next part of his journey will make you rethink what it truly means to protect what you've been given. That evening, Evan's phone lit up with a message from his father. The words were curt, not a request but a command. Come to the house. Tonight, we need to talk about a fair arrangement. The address wasn't necessary. He had spent enough of his childhood in that cold, echoing space to know the route by heart. When he arrived, the atmosphere was more like a boardroom than a family living room. Richard sat at the head of the dining table, a stack of papers in front of him. Diane hovered nearby, lips pressed tight, her posture the embodiment of disapproval. Jason lounged in a chair to one side, flipping a pen in his hand as if he were already bored. Pamela and Stephen lingered in the background, their faces expectant. Richard wasted no time. He slid a crisp contract across the polished wood toward Evan. "Sign this. You transfer all assets, money, company shares into my name. In return, I'll give you 10%. You'll still be taken care of, but the responsibility will rest with someone who knows what they're doing." Jason leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I'm not greedy," he said with a half smile. $5 million will cover the launch of my crypto startup. That's all I'm asking." His tone suggested it was a modest request. Pamela crossed her arms, her voice cool. "And I'll take the house. Harold and Elizabeth's place. It's wasted on you." "Evan, you're young. You don't need that kind of property." The words landed like stones. Each request came dressed as reason, but beneath it was a clear message: surrender or be cast out. Evan's refusal was quiet but unshakable. No, just one word. Yet it cut through the room. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave here with nothing. No place in this family. You think Harold and Elizabeth's money will shield you? It won't." Then Diane revealed what they had been holding back. "We own the building you rent. The lease is ours. Consider it canceled. You have 30 minutes to collect your belongings." There was no shouting match, no pleading, only the abrupt scrape of a chair as Evan stood, the air thick with their satisfaction at forcing his hand. But his hands did not tremble as he left. In the dark, under a sky without stars, he packed what little he could: a few changes of clothes, a box of books, and the knitted blanket Elizabeth had made for him years ago. The walk down those apartment steps felt both endless and final. Every sound, the click of the latch, the thud of his bag on the pavement, etched itself into memory. There was no one waiting for him, no open door, no comforting voice. Only the sharp bite of night air and the weight of what he had just learned: their love had never been unconditional. Their loyalty never to him, but to what he could be made to hand over. He turned away from the building without looking back, the blanket folded neatly under his arm. It was more than woolen thread. It was proof that someone once had cared enough to make something just for him, without expecting anything in return. In that moment, walking alone through the quiet streets, Evan understood that being stripped of comfort could also strip away illusions. The people who try to buy your compliance rarely see the strength they create in you when you refuse the offer. And sometimes losing the place you live is the first step toward finding the place you truly belong. The cottage smelled faintly of cedar and the lavender sachets Elizabeth had tucked into every drawer. Evan stood in the narrow hallway, his shoes sinking slightly into the worn rug Harold had insisted on keeping, despite its frayed edges. This was not the grand house with high ceilings and polished floors where family gatherings had once taken place. It was smaller, humbler, a retreat his grandparents had used for quiet weekends. And now it was all he had. He had arrived just before dawn, carrying his meager belongings in 2 bags and the blanket folded carefully on top. The first light of morning crept through the curtains, painting soft gold on the photographs that lined the shelves. In each frame, there was laughter: Elizabeth holding a pie fresh from the oven, Harold caught mid-swing at a charity golf tournament, both of them smiling at a much younger Evan in his school uniform. Here, the air did not carry the sharp sting of rejection, it carried memory. A knock at the door broke the silence. Matthew Goldstein stepped inside, his expression more gentle than at the will reading. "They planned for this," he said simply. He placed a folder on the kitchen table. Inside were the documents for the property deed, held in a private trust Harold and Elizabeth had established years ago. No one else had known about it. It meant this cottage was legally and irrevocably Evan's, beyond the reach of Richard or Diane. Later that morning, Carlos appeared, the family's long-serving groundskeeper. Time had etched lines into his face, but his eyes lit up at the sight of Evan, from the worn satchel at his side. Carlos produced a small flash drive. "You should see this," he said. On the screen, grainy footage from the days after the funeral came into focus. Richard and Jason, moving through Harold and Elizabeth's home, loading boxes into the back of a van, jewelry cases, antique clocks, even the china set Elizabeth had promised Evan as a wedding gift one day. They hadn't even waited a week. By afternoon, Dorothy arrived, a former housekeeper who had retired years earlier. She carried with her a leather-bound journal, edges softened with age. "She wanted you to have this," Dorothy said, placing it in Evan's hands. Inside were Elizabeth's neat cursive notes, dates, and accounts of each time a family member had pressured them for money. Some entries were sharp with disappointment, others tender with affection. Especially when she wrote of Evan. One line, circled in ink, read, "He is the only one who never asked for more than love." As the day faded, Evan realized that his inheritance was not just the figure in the bank ledger. It was the trust his grandparents had built in people who would stand beside him when the rest turned away. The cottage was a shelter, yes, but it was also a fortress of truth. Every object, every record, a piece of armor. Standing in the kitchen, his hands resting on the journal, he understood something Harold had once tried to explain. While they were fixing a fence in the rain, a man's safety doesn't come from what he owns, but from the people who will show up when he's in trouble. That night, the wind pressed gently against the windows, and the old floorboards creaked under his steps. For the first time since the will reading, Evan slept without waking in the middle of the night. The world outside might be preparing its next move, but inside these walls, he had something far more valuable than the millions everyone else wanted. He had proof, allies, and a legacy of trust that money alone could never buy. They came on a Saturday morning, pulling up in two dark SUVs that crunched the gravel outside the cottage. Richard was the first to step out, his coat flaring in the wind, followed closely by Diane in a sharp black suit, her heels striking the ground like punctuation marks. Jason emerged last, sunglasses hiding his eyes, phone in hand as if he were arriving for a business negotiation. Behind them trailed Pamela and Stephen, faces tight with determination. Evan watched from the front steps, the air around him calm despite the storm, walking toward his door. But he was not alone. Beside him stood Matthew Goldstein, the contract folder tucked neatly under his arm. To the left, Carlos, the loyal groundskeeper, crossed his arms and set his stance. Dorothy arrived moments later, clasping her handbag like it was a shield. A few feet beyond them, parked in unmarked vehicles, were the county sheriff and two deputies, men who had once shared coffee with Harold on early mornings. Inside the living room, the confrontation unfolded. Richard began with authority in his voice, speaking of retrieving what rightfully belongs to the family. Diane nodded along, her tone sharp with the same righteousness. Pamela's voice was colder, accusing Evan of turning his back on blood. Jason leaned casually against the wall, smirking, as if waiting for Evan to realize he was outnumbered. But then Matthew placed a thick stack of folder on the table. "Before we go further, I suggest you each take a look at these." His voice carried no anger, only certainty. One by one, the files were slid across to each relative. Inside one, there were copies of bank statements showing unpaid loans Richard had taken from Harold and never returned. Screenshots of Jason's messages to a broker arranging the sale of company assets without authorization. Pamela's falsified checks, drawn on accounts that didn't belong to her. And photographs of them entering Harold and Elizabeth's home after the funeral, loading valuables into a van. There was more, a printed email exchange in which Richard and Pamela had discussed declaring Elizabeth mentally unfit to gain control over her finances. The sheriff, standing in the doorway, confirmed that some of the evidence was already under preliminary review. Pamela's hands trembled as she closed the folder. Jason's smirk faded. Diane's gaze darted toward the door, as though calculating an exit. Richard clenched his jaw but said nothing. Then Jason broke the silence, his voice low but defiant. "This isn't over." The sheriff stepped forward. "With this much on record, it's already over." His tone left no space for argument. One by one, they left, some muttering under their breath, others silent. Stephen paused at the doorway, looking back at Evan with an expression that carried something different: hesitation, perhaps even regret before following the others out. When the door closed, the room seemed to exhale. Evan looked at the faces around him. Matthew, Carlos, Dorothy, the sheriff, and knew that this victory wasn't just about keeping the money or the cottage. It was about drawing a line, holding it, and proving that greed could be met not with more greed, but with truth and preparation. Harold had once told him, while tightening the bolts on a gate, that you don't win a battle by shouting louder, you win by being ready when the other side makes their move. That morning, standing in the home his grandparents had shielded for him, Evan understood exactly what that meant. The game hadn't just been reversed, it had been finished. 6 months had passed since that cold morning when the last door had closed on his relative's retreat. The cottage now carried the rhythm of a life rebuilt, fresh paint on the shutters, a vegetable garden taking root in the side yard, and a desk in the corner where Evan planned something that mattered far more than simply holding on to money. On a quiet spring afternoon, sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the Portland Community Hall. Rows of chairs filled the main floor, each one occupied by students in their best clothes, some holding trembling hands, others clutching envelopes with uncertain eyes. Banners overhead read, "The Harold and Elizabeth Foster Foundation." Evan stood at the podium, his voice steady as he spoke about opportunity, how it could open the door to a future, but only if someone believed you were worth the key. The foundation's first round of scholarships would go to underprivileged students, with a special priority for LGBTQ+ youth who had been rejected by their own families. It was more than a program. It was a promise he was keeping in his grandparents' names. One by one, students came forward to receive their certificates and scholarships. There were handshakes, hugs, tears. But when the final name was called, the room fell into a hush. A tall, slender 17-year-old stepped forward, nervous, shoulders drawn in as if bracing for judgment. The announcement echoed: recipient of the Harold and Elizabeth Foster Scholarship, Daniel Whitmore. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Whitmore. Evan's gaze shifted to the side of the room, where Stephen stood, his hands clasped, eyes glistening. The boy approached, and when Evan handed him the envelope, Stephen's voice broke. "He's my son, and he's gay. I never wanted him to go through what I've seen in this family. Now he has a chance to get out, to make something better." The weight of that moment was not in the money being given, but in the bridge it quietly built. Stephen's expression carried gratitude, but also something unspoken, a recognition that the past could bend toward a different kind of future. As the applause rose again, Evan realized the truth that had been waiting for him all along. The $20 million had been a tool, nothing more. The real inheritance Harold and Elizabeth had left him was the understanding that wealth finds its highest purpose when it moves beyond the boundaries of blood, beyond the fences of old grudges, and into the lives of those who need it most. When the ceremony ended, the hall emptied slowly. Daniel stood near the doorway, talking to other recipients, smiling with a freedom that reminded Evan of what it felt like the first time he knew he could live without apology. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could almost hear Elizabeth's voice, warm and sure. "This is why we trusted you." Now I'm curious, if you were in Evan's place, would you have been able to forgive Stephen enough to give his son that scholarship? Or would you have turned away because of the family history? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know how you see it. If Evan's journey made you think about what true legacy means and how it can change lives, make sure to subscribe to Heart Stories so you don't miss the stories that matter most.